to go. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Silk and Steel podcast. We have a Christmas Eve special, Christmas Eve for those of you who are in North America. Some of you have already watched my video with Ajay Papa and Nina Byzantina talking about Putin's Russia. So I decided to invite Nina back for a show on China-Russia relationship. Nina is obviously very knowledgeable. She has a PhD in history. She was born in Soviet Union, so she knew what is alike. And with her depth of knowledge in geopolitical analysis, I thought, hey, this would be the perfect collab to dispel a lot of the myth and disinfo that's proliferating through Western info space. Welcome to this. So first of all, welcome to the show, Lena.
Thank you for having me back. That was quite the introduction. This is a lot to live up to. And I'm not doing much to dispel the myths. I'm wearing red in commemoration of the initial Soviet-Chinese friendship. So I'm probably not doing a lot to dispel that particular, Russia is still communist myth. So, but nonetheless, I think this would be a really interesting discussion. I've never discussed China, and I am an outsider. So I've actually sort of on my own time, I've been slowly learning about China on a, very surface level, because Chinese history is much, much, much longer than Russia's history. So I'm sort of trying to go through the dynasties. I'm trying to find translations of Li Bai. So I'm doing my best to to understand sort of the other side of the coin. Mm-hmm.
You are a Japan specialist, right?
I'm not a specialist, but it's been my interest for a while. So I've actually been learning this on my own. And I have written some things about Japan. And I think maybe you and I at one point should do something about the perceptions of World War II in Japan today. I've been to Japan many times. This is sort of a side note. I visited one of their... It wasn't a general World War II museum. It was specific to the prisoners of war in the Soviet Union. And, prisoners of war are not necessarily treated nice, but the way things were presented just absolutely blew my mind. And so we know how Japan perceives the Chinese question with World War II. So I think if we ever wanted to do a narrow topic, that would be quite the can of worms to open. So...
Yeah, and Japan would play a major role in a relationship between Russia and China. This is what we're going to talk about. We're going to go all the way from, the historical period to the modern period. So I thought maybe we just give a brief overview of the China-Russia relationship from the very beginning. The two countries, even though they started out at the far end of Eurasian continent, but they were bounded by some commonalities in history. Both places were conquered by Mongols, and after the overthrow of the Mongol Empire, two sides start to expanding toward each other, and this the Russians always have an interest to expand the market for fur. For example, that's what drew Russians to Siberia. But the largest market for fur at that time was actually China. So Russia had a very strong interest to establish trade relationship with China, and that also partly drove their eastward expansion through the Siberian wilderness. And by the end of Ming Dynasty, the Russia has already came into contact with the Mongol tribes in Siberia. They already heard there's a Bogda Khan, or the Khan of the heaven, that sits somewhere in the south, and so they knew they have the right direction, and then around 1640s, that's when the two sides the border clash, the expansion start to converge. The borders start closing in the inner Asian space when both Russia and the Qing China, they were annexing the Mongol lands, and they came to clash around the Amur River Valley area. By the way, Nina, jump in anytime because I am presenting this, obviously from a Chinese perspective.
You're actually not contradicting anything that I've read, and I'm not a specialist on that early period, so my knowledge is more surface-based. But I think it's interesting that you mentioned that the two were invaded by the Mongols, because in Russian history, historiography, that initial contact actually takes place during that period in the 1300s, when a lot of, I guess they were enslaved, right? Conquered Russians were brought to the Mongol-controlled China, and they were used for work, right? They were used in farming, but interesting, they were also used in defense. So that initial contact was made earlier, but then, of course, up until the period that you're describing, right, the Ming Dynasty, and especially the Qing Dynasty, that contact was pretty sporadic. So yeah, you're exactly right. This is when the border clashes started happening around the Amur River. And so by, 1689, right, there's the first major agreement. This is the Treaty of Nerchinsk. And this is when Russia initially loses to China, right? So it ends up giving up some of the lands in the region of that river in the Far East. But if we go forward 200 years, we're sort of covering large chunks of time right now to 1858, right? That treaty was sort of overturned. You know which one I'm talking about, right? I don't know how to pronounce it properly. In Russian, I would say the Treaty of Aigun, but I don't know how you say it. How you say it in Chinese.
So what happened was, the Russian. So this is very great. This is great because now we have the Chinese perspective and the Russian perspective, and this is important because from our previous show on Putin's Russia, some commenter on YouTube have pointed out that they say Carl is wrong. The three world. The three world is the first world is about United States and all its allies. The second world is all the communist country, and the third world is what today known as global South. But I was brought up in a completely different environment because what I learned is Mao's theory of three worlds. So I didn't even realize the Mao theory of three worlds is different from the Western definition of first world, second world, and
Are you surprised that the West would put itself at the top, Carl?
Because according to Mao's theory of three worlds, the first world is United States and Soviet Union, the two superpowers, and the second world is like all it's the vassal states of the United States in Europe, Japan, etc. And the third world, which Mao placed China in, would be what today we call the global South. So this is like where. This is when I realized, oh, wait a minute. There's a difference in perspective. From what I brought up is completely different from what people who brought up with a Western lens. But back to Russia and China relations. The two sides clashed, and that did result in one of the first treaty that China signed with a European power, Russia in this case, is the Treaty of Nerchinsk, which defined the border for about 200 years. And then came the first Opium War and the second Opium War. Now, Russia is not a participant, but the second Opium War was carried out by the joint Anglo-French forces, which occupied Beijing. So the Chinese emperor at that time was panicking. He escaped Beijing, but this is where the Russian ambassador approached him and said, "Hey, I can mediate. I can mediate between you and the French and the Anglos for a price." The price is you have to give up all this land north of the Amur River and then all the land east of Ussuri River. And at that time, the Qing emperor was, he was panicked. He just, okay, whatever. I'll fine. Anything as long as you can bring about peace. I agree to anything you ask. So this is when the border got redefined. First in 1858 in the Treaty of Aigun, and then confirmed in the Convention of Peking in 1860, which settled the Second Opium War. So Russia gained the territory north of Amur River and east of Ussuri River, and then from the period from Opium War to 1900. I mean, at that time, Russia is just like another imperial power, other European imperial power that was coming in to carve up its sphere of influence in China. And this actually brought Russia into conflict with another rising imperial power, that of Japan, because Russia wanted Manchuria to remain in its sphere of influence. This was challenged after Japan won the first Sino-Japanese War in 1894 and 1895, where Japan carved out the Liaodong Peninsula, the southern Manchuria, but this obviously goes against Russia's interests. So Russia, together with Germany and France, they did the tripartite intervention when the three powers sent warships to Tokyo Bay and threatened Japan to give up the newly acquired Chinese land in Manchuria, because Russia wants that land for itself. Russia wants a warm water port. So Japan was forced to give up that land for a price. China had to pay a large indemnity in silver to redeem that land back. But this created resentment on the side of Japan against the Tsarist Russia.
Do you know much about that 1896 kind of a quasi-defense agreement between Russia and China?
Yes.
That was basically annulled because Russia lost to Japan 9 years later.
Yes. So immediately after China lost to Japan in the first Sino-Japanese War, the Chinese Chancellor Li Hongzhang, he felt he needed to bring in Russia to counter Japan. In Chinese, the traditional Chinese diplomacy, we call that use barbarians to counter barbarians. So this is Li Hongzhang's method. He went to St. Petersburg for, I think it was either for a coronation or birthday of Tsar Nicholas II. And it's during this trip, he signed the secret Russia-China protocol, which would grant Russia the rights to build railroad into Manchuria. So at that time, even though Russia acquired all this land north of Amur River and east of Ussuri River and gained the port Vladivostok, it has there's no reliable transportation to reach the east. So Russia was very interested to build a railroad connecting across Eurasia. This would be the Trans-Siberian Railroad. But they will save a lot of distance by cutting through Manchuria. That would be the Trans-Manchurian Railway. And the secret Russian-Chinese treaty granted the Russians the concession rights to build the railroad. In return, Russia will gain the land 10 kilometers on the either side of the railroad. They will remain the operational control of the railroad. They can post troops to protect the railroad. And again, Japan was not liking that. And Russia then also finagled the right to lease Port Arthur for 99 years. Port Arthur in today's Chinese city of Dalian. This is a warm water port, which is what Russia always wanted in Far East Asia, because I believe even Vladivostok still freezes over in the winter. So then Russia started to go build a railroad from Siberia, connecting to cross Manchuria to Vladivostok, but also build another railroad heading south to the city of Dalian, to Port Arthur, which became the headquarters of the Russian Imperial fleet in the Far East. Again, Japan was not happy about this. So all this later lead to the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 and 1905, in which Russia was defeated. In return, Japan gained. So they gained the south, but Japan, it was not a complete victory for Japan, because the Trans-Siberian Railroad finally finished near the end of the war. So by that time, Russia could bring man and resources much faster to Manchuria than Japan. And so Japan was forced to accept a deal where Russia didn't have to pay anything to Japan, because Japan was expecting a large war indemnity like they did during the first Sino-Japanese War. But through the intervention of American President Roosevelt, they signed the treaty to end the war, where Japan was allowed to keep southern half, basically southern half of Manchuria, including Port Arthur, and they gained the rights to the Southern Manchurian Railway, which is Russia has built, and then by the way, and there's a, we don't have time to get into this, but there's other fascinating facet of Russia-China interaction, because there's the Far East Russia is sparsely populated. So to build the Trans-Siberian, Trans-Manchurian Railway, Russia, it needed Chinese labor. So this actually sparked a huge Chinese migration into Manchuria, because before late 19th century, the Manchu Emperor, they prohibited Han Chinese from migrating into Manchuria because they want to preserve the Manchu homeland for themselves. But because of the fight of Russia and Japan over Manchuria, that's when the Qing Emperor realized, okay, we can't leave the land empty anymore. Let's open up the floodgate, let the Han Chinese go settle in Manchuria. And the Russian-built railroad, Trans-Manchurian, was a big facilitator. Now people, a lot of famine refugees in Hebei and Shandong, they just board the train and go to Manchuria to settle the new land. And this so this period of Russia Japan kind of competition will lead to later to World War I, and then the October Revolution, eventually October Revolution. And at that time, Soviet Union was, Soviet Russia was trying to, they were diplomatically isolated. There was an Allied intervention in the Russian Civil War.
Yeah, I call it an invasion, but they call it an intervention. May I make two small points about this 1905 Russo-Japan 1904-05. So I think even though for Japan this wasn't a complete victory, as you're saying, it was definitely a propaganda victory, because Japan sort of solidified its place as the white man of Asia, right? Using big scare quotes here. It allowed Japan to really go farther into Korea, right? To occupy Korea. So that expansion began around this period. And obviously, no one expected, or at least in Europe, no one expected Japan to be this technologically advanced for its time power. I apologize. She usually comes at the end of my shows, not in the beginning. She decides to visit. Thank you for visiting. You're not a contributor today. Yeah, and so I think from that standpoint, it was really important for Japan to be interpreted among the great powers, right, of Europe and the rising power in the US. For Russia, this war, oh my goodness, you're trying to destroy all my Russian dolls here. That's not nice. And for Russia, this was devastating because there was a lot of smaller scale social unrest. You had various anarchic, nihilistic socialist groups operating from the 1860s onwards. Some of these university students, sometimes they would engage in acts of terrorism, sometimes very successful, like the assassination of Alexander II, some other big politicians in the early 1900s. But that war was really draining Russia's economy. It really had a bad public image. So the failed revolution of 1905, where the government opened fire on some of the protesters, that really was exacerbated by the Russo-Japanese War. So even though Japan didn't, it won the war, but it wasn't as, fully victorious as you're saying, for Russia, it was a very, very damaging war internally, and it really set it on its path to worsening socioeconomic tensions and ultimately the Russian Revolution, right? So starting from about 1912 or so, there were a lot more protests in cities coming from, the literal working class who was not happy with its working conditions. You obviously then had World War I, which exacerbated the initially poor conditions for, the working class in 1905. So all of those things were sort of compounding on each other. And the end result was the Russian Revolution. And I know there are a lot of quasi-conspiracy theorists. I mean, it's not wrong to say that some of the Bolsheviks had funding coming from the outside, but I feel like that's really irrelevant. The social conditions in the entire country were ripe for a change in government. And unfortunately, it was obviously a very violent change in government with a civil war to follow. But yes, let's now get to the isolation of the Soviet Union that you were talking about.
Yeah, because even that time, even the warlord government in China, because China also had its own revolution in 1911. The 1,000-year-old monarchy was overthrown, and China became a republic. But it's a republic in name only, because pretty soon China basically fell into what's today known as a warlord period, where different warlords carved up a different province in China. But there's a nominal government in Beijing, and this warlord government in Beijing was convinced by the Allied powers to join World War I, and then by providing Chinese labor. And so about 250,000 Chinese men were sent to the Western Front in Europe. They were supposed to work in factories, so allow the European men to go fight. But a lot of the cases, these Chinese men were also sent to do very dangerous job of digging trenches and dragging out bodies and taking the wounded from the fire line. But in Russia, a similar number also went to Russia. They went to build railroad, to man factories. In fact, during World War I, they have to the Allies, because the Russia was cut off by Ottoman Turkey from breaking out the Black Sea. So they decide to open a new supply route to Russia through the Arctic at the port of Murmansk. And Russia is said to build a railroad connecting Murmansk in the Arctic to St. Petersburg. And out of the 60,000 labor committed to build this railroad to the Arctic, 10,000 were Chinese. So at that time, there were a lot of Chinese men working in Russia, and many of them got caught up in this Russian Civil War and the revolution. And many of them, because out of necessity, they joined the Bolshevik side, because the white side didn't like them very much. I mean, the white side didn't like, they were pretty racist toward Chinese.
Well, they also, the White Army had a lot of factional infighting. They had their own warlords in the Far East, so that's a whole nother story. But I think we can mention this, officially it's known as the 1918 intervention. I mean, it's an outright invasion by multiple European countries. Obviously, at the forefront, you had Britain and France, the United States, and of course, Japan. So the regions impacted were the Far East, but for the US and Japan, also the Northwest for the European powers. And then, of course, the European powers were also very interested in A, the Caucasus, B, what was Ukraine or present-day Ukraine, and basically the southern Russia. So those were the three focal points for this so-called intervention. Now, officially, and of course, you had sort of breakaway things like the Czech Legion that was initially part of the World War I effort until the 1917 Russian Revolution. Yeah. And so officially they were fighting against the Bolsheviks, but of course, in reality, they were basically looting. So you talked about the furs in the Far East, right? That logging and fur industries and mining, right? Those were the main industries there. So they were basically taking anything they could. And they were not really very nice to the local population that really wasn't supporting either side. In fact, they turned the local population in some places towards the Bolsheviks because they would just get brutally beaten and shot. I have a video on my channel about this topic. I had to read some documents, and I was kind of shocked that I didn't really learn much about this, and discovering this as an adult was really shocking, because you kind of usually read about this nice little adventure for these powers that came to fight the Bolsheviks. But, in reality, when you hear modern calls to dismember Russia, you really think back to, oh, well, this was definitely what they were trying to do at that time, but they were not successful. One of the main reasons was, for instance, there was a mutiny in Odessa on the Black Sea for the French, because they were just exhausted from fighting in World War I, and here they are being sent to invade, the collapsing Russian Empire and sort of engage in military adventurism, quote unquote, there. So eventually they kind of had to pull out, and obviously the Bolsheviks, against all odds, were eventually successful in reconquering parts of what was the Russian Empire, and eventually assembling most of it into what became the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I mean, many people, especially in America, they don't even realize American troops participated in invasion of Russia, both in the occupation of the Arctic in the port city of Murmansk, but also in the Far East. The Americans and the Japanese, they landed in Vladivostok and then pushed towards Siberia. And they even forced pressure the warlord government of China in Beijing to send troops, some token troops to participate. But Japan sent the largest contingent in Far East. They had like about 70,000 troops on the ground. They occupied much of the Far East, all the way up to Lake Baikal.
There's some very interesting Japanese propaganda posters of gleeful Russians meeting the liberating Japanese forces with Japanese imperial flags in Vladivostok. Yeah, they're very interesting encapsulations of that entire experience in a single image.
I mean, I read an account where when the Red Army was pushing toward Vladivostok, there was a episode where the Reds, they wanted to they want to expel the Japanese, but they didn't have the heavy weapons. They didn't have artillery, so they approached the Chinese, because even though the Chinese were supposedly on the Allied side with Japan, but the two sides have no love for each other. So the Chinese commander let them on the down low loan them the Chinese artillery so they can bombard the Japanese position. There's a many interesting anecdotes from that era. But then that the Soviet power now reached the Pacific, and they have an issue still with all the Russian concession in Manchuria, because Russia, even after Russo-Japanese War, they still control the northern half of the Manchuria. In fact, the city of Harbin, which is today the capital of Heilongjiang province, was built at that time because it sits on the junction of the railroad of the Trans-Siberian and the Trans-Manchurian. And if people go to Harbin, in the center of Harbin, there's a gigantic Orthodox church, Saint Sophia, and like there were hundreds of thousands of Russians living there. And during the Russian Civil War, a lot of white Russian refugees flood into Manchuria. So the white Russians that retained the control.
Yeah, they went to Harbin, but they also went as far as Shanghai. There was a big diaspora living there too. So they went to different places. It was really interesting.
Yes, and the white Russians that retained the control of the Trans-Manchurian Railway, with the support of the Allied power. So this is where the Soviet diplomacy, they said, you know what? We renounce all the unequal treaties with China, so China can have the railroad back. We renounce all the rights to the railroad. So in this way, the Soviet were finally able to finagle their way to get back into Manchuria. In the end, the railway ownership was divided to 50-50 between the 50% will be controlled by the Soviet, 50% will be controlled by the Japanese, and this would persist until 1931, the Mukden incident, when Japan launched a attack to occupy all of Manchuria, and that's when the kind of the border between Manchuria and Soviet Union became tense again, because Japan was a hostile power, and there was the whole border became militarized, because at that time there was a big debate between the Japanese army and the Japanese Navy. The Japanese Navy, they wanted to go south toward Southeast Asia, where they can grab all the oil fields in the European colonies, in the British and the Dutch colonies. And whereas the Japanese army, they want to go north. They want to go fight the Russians in Siberia. And so they did that in
38, and that didn't really lead much. And then there was the big one in Mongolia, right? In 1939, yes. This was the Battle of Khalkhin Gol, and they kept using the occupied Manchukuo / Manchuria, right? The initial one was to enter the Soviet Union, and this one was to enter Mongolia. And that battle was really devastating for Japan. I mean, they lost a lot of troops. In fact, one of the commanders for the Soviet side was the future Marshal of Victory, Zhukov. So he was obviously gaining experience there that he then took to the European theater in World War II. But this is where the Japanese lost their interest in fighting the Soviet Union and the United States at the same time. And I think it's also important, you talked about oil, right? The US was basically preventing Japan from having access to oil, and Japan was really needing that energy to power its expanding empire. And so, I mean, if you read some of the texts about what Japan was using, I mean, sometimes they were using horses, which is not unusual. You did also have that a little bit for Germany and the Soviet Union, but comparing that to American oil-powered jeeps, I mean, it was a big thing, right? For instance, like in the Philippines. So yeah, this was definitely something that they needed. So they decided to focus on the US and kind of leave the Soviet Union alone after they lost. I think it was like, the percentage I saw was like 75% of their troops or something. It was a very significant amount. And obviously Mongolians participated in the battle too, so we want to give them credit for it. But yeah, it was an interesting experience. Mm-hmm.
So this gave the upper hand to the Japanese Navy in their debate against the Japanese Army. So this will lead to December 7th, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor and the Pacific War. And then another thing I do need to mention was after the full-scale war broke out between Japan and China in 1937, at that time, the Western powers, the European and the American, even though they have a lot of commercial interests in China, but they didn't want to get involved. You know, they don't want to get involved because they have bigger issue to deal with back in Europe with Hitler, rise of Hitler. So at that time, Chiang Kai-shek was hoping to bring in Western intervention to stop Japan. That's why he chose the battlefield in Shanghai. You know, that was one of the biggest battles that was fought in the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Battle of Shanghai. The Chiang Kai-shek's idea is, if we fight the war right in the center of Shanghai, in front of all the colonial powers, for sure they will come in and stop Japan. That did not happen, even though a American ship, American gunboat Panay, was bombed in the Yangtze River by the Japanese. You know, the Americans just pretended that they didn't notice, like how they pretended that Israel didn't bomb USS Liberty. And so at that time, the only outside power that came to China's aid was Soviet Union, because, you know, the Soviet, they did also aware of the increasing alliance that was formed between Japan and Germany. They didn't want to face a two-front war. So it's also in Stalin's interest to support China in the fight against Japan. So Soviet Red Army pilots that flew directly,
specialists, pilots, military advisors, and I think they also helped with the building of a highway, from what I understand, to deliver goods from the USSR. So this was in the West. I think this was in Xinjiang, yes. I think so. Yeah, it was a pretty big undertaking considering the geopolitical circumstances.
Yeah, so the Soviet Red Army pilots, they would fly directly from Soviet Central Asia, make one stop in central China, and they'll fly directly into the Battle of Shanghai. And this will bring to the, like, okay, we're moving rather quickly, but this will bring to the end of World War II, when
I think the one highlight here is the fact that Mao's son participated in the Red Army, which always, blows my mind.
He was sent to Moscow to study, like many children of the communist leadership, and they were in Moscow at the time, and at the time of the Operation Barbarossa, the Nazi Germany invasion of the Soviet Union. So that was interesting. And then towards the end of World War II, in 1945, Japan was already being defeated everywhere else in the Pacific. So they decided to launch a big push in the continental East Asia, try to link up their controlled territory from Manchuria all the way to Vietnam. So instead of relying on marine transport, because most of their merchant marine has been sunk by American submarine by this time, so they decide to rely on rail link. So they did a major push called Operation Ichigo in 1944, try to link up all their occupied area from Manchuria to Vietnam. And this was one of the humiliating defeat for the Chinese, because this was toward the end of the World War II, and there was a huge collapse of the Chinese army. Japan took a huge chunk of territory, and they were able to accomplish their objective to link the railroad from Harbin to Hanoi to Vietnam. And at that time, that's when the Americans, they come to a realization they cannot rely on Chiang Kai-shek to defeat the Japanese on mainland Asia. Then they approach Stalin.
Well, they've been negotiating Stalin's entry into the Asia Pacific theater for a while, and they agreed upon it in Yalta for when the big three met, and they sort of really ironed out their plans in Germany, right, in Potsdam in the summer of 1945. And so obviously by then the Red Army was free to enter that theater, and this is like a 1 million strong army, because they've now were successful and victorious in the European theater. So they were free to do this. And so this is one of the big questions as to whether the Americans, specifically President Truman, who made the decision to drop the 2 atomic bombs, whether that was necessary. And, in my opinion, it was unnecessary, because you already had that commitment from the Soviet Union, and they did enter Manchuria between the 2 bombings. So you knew that was going to collapse like a house of cards. So be that as it may, this is a separate question, but yeah, Stalin lived up to his promise, and he committed, it was like over 1 million people to Manchuria. And of course, Japan had some labor camps in that region. So reading about their liberation, and it had people from, not just the local Chinese and maybe some Russians, but also Americans and Europeans that were in these labor camps. Reading about the liberation was pretty interesting, but go ahead.
Yeah. So Stalin, for one of he did have some conditions for his participation in the entry against Japan, and in particular, this would lead to the Sino-Chinese Friendship Treaty that was signed in August 1945. This was the condition was China would recognize a formal independence of Mongolia, because Mongolia was part of the Qing Empire that broke away after the 1911 revolution. And then, and it changed hands several times. And finally, in 1920, the Soviet Red Army came in, helped the Mongolian communists to establish the People's Republic of Mongolia. But this was not recognized by the successful Chinese government. So Mongolia had de facto independence, but not de jure. So one of the Soviet conditions was the Republic of China under Chiang Kai-shek's government would recognize independence of Mongolia to allow holding a referendum in Mongolia to decide for Mongolian independence. So that was done. And the Soviet will restore their sphere of influence in Manchuria. So including the Soviet Navy will return to Port Arthur, and Soviet would have some kind of operational control of the Trans-Manchurian Railroad. And so this was also agreed to. And this would let during the August storm, more than 1 million Soviet Red Army pour across the border into Manchuria. They made very quick progress, demolished the Japanese Guangdong the 750,000 Man Kwangdong Army in a couple of weeks, and the Soviet Red Army pushed down to Korea. And this is when the American State Department folks start panicking. They're like, whoa, wait a minute. The rate of the progress, the Red Army is going to be in Japan before we arrive. So they came up a proposal to Stalin, said, okay, let's draw a line, 38th parallel across the Korean Peninsula. The Soviet Red Army would agree to stop north of 38th parallel, and you'll leave the southern half of the Korean Peninsula for us, because it's going to take us a month, a few weeks to get our ship there to take the Japanese surrender. So this would Stalin agreed to that deal. This basically led to the division of Korea.
Stalin agreed to a lot of deals. It was the Soviet Red Army that conquered Berlin, lost a ton of people, and then it just invited the Brits and the Americans and the French for that quadripartite initial division of Berlin. And then, of course, it was split into the two spheres, popularly thought to be done by the Soviets, but it was actually done more so by the Americans. Yeah, so I think if you actually look at Stalin's foreign policy, it was very agreeable in this time when it came to, I guess, powers that he considered to be at his level, and obviously in this particular context. I have a question for you. Go ahead.
Okay, go keep that question in mind. But to be fair to Stalin, at that time, America was looking to be quite unstoppable, because at the end of World War II, Soviet Union was devastated. So Europe was devastated. United States was 50% of the world's GDP. They had the 50% of the world's manufacturing, because their homeland, U.S., was untouched by war. And right after World War II, Stalin realized Soviet Union needs time to recover. He was not interested to go into a new conflict. Unlike, say, General Patton. General Patton famously said, "Oh, we fought the wrong enemy. We fought on the wrong side."
Oh, he's made lots of really fun statements about the Russians, and of course, when he said the Russians, he meant all the entire Red Army, which was multi-ethnic, calling them drunks and, basically almost like subhumans. So he's known for his mildly racist, to put it mildly.
Go ahead with your question.
Well, I actually wanted to comment on the Stalin issue as well. I think that particular period is the birth of the false trope that the Soviet Union wanted to conquer the world, because, as you pointed out, the Soviet Union was completely devastated, right? The official death toll is 27 million, which is partly military, so that's about 9 million. The rest were civilians. Obviously, that entire European part of Russia and, modern day Ukraine, Belarus, etc., was devastated through warfare. You could still go into any random forest and you can find relics from that period, 80 years later. You can find maybe a skull, you can find, helmets, etc. You can find mines. The earth still gives you sort of even though it's been so many decades, the earth sort of breathes that conflict still. And then they kind of wonder, why do the Russians celebrate Victory Day? But anyway, Stalin's goal was to push the border as far out to protect the Soviet Union as possible. Russia, in its various forms, had been invaded through the Polish corridor twice, right through Napoleon with Hitler. And so this is why Stalin went, into places like Poland. It wasn't like, I'm going to conquer the entire world. It was to make, basically to create a very big security border. But I think it's important to point that out. But my question for you was, so in Soviet historiography, that period 1945 to the Chinese Revolution of 1949, is that the Soviet Union was very helpful in aiding the Chinese Communist Party to eventually be victorious. How is this interpreted in Chinese history?
So this is very interesting, because this was obviously recognized during the Sino-Soviet honeymoon period. That would we're jumping ahead a little bit, so let me go chronologically, because right after the end of the World War II, after Japanese surrender, you ended up with the Soviet Red Army occupying like all of Manchuria, all the way up to the Great Wall, and then most of the Chiang Kai-shek's army at that time was holed up in the southwest portion of China, and then the rest is occupied by the Japanese. There was a rush to take the territory from the. There's a rush between the Chinese communists and the KMT under Chiang Kai-shek to grab the territories to be vacated by the Japanese. So this is where the Cold War kind of dawned in East Asia, because the Soviet, obviously they wanted to make sure their interests are protected in Manchuria, whereas America's post-war plan for East Asia is they plan to have Chiang Kai-shek as their junior partner to be kind of like play the role that later Japan would play for United States, basically. So this was U.S. plan. So U.S. had provided a lot of the war material to Chiang Kai-shek. So during the war, United States promised to deliver a lot of weapons through land lease agreement to Chiang Kai-shek. But because it was a very limited way to get supplies into China, only way to supply China at that time it was through the Himalayan hump. They will fly from air base in India over the Himalayas into China. So a very small percentage of aid that was promised was actually delivered to China. But that bottleneck was removed after World War II. So all these weapons start to arrive in China just in time for the Chinese Civil War. And then American Navy, they will ship. Another thing Americans don't know about is United States deploy about 60 to 70,000 troops into China after World War II. They're sending 50,000 Marines to China in what's called the Operation Beleaguered. Their ostensive goal was to evacuate the Japanese army and the Japanese civilians from mainland China back to Japan. But their other goal, I would argue their primary goal, was actually to ship Chiang Kai-shek's army to this Japan-occupied China to take control, because the communists were a lot closer, because especially in northern China, the communists control the countryside. They don't control the big cities, which was in the hands of Japanese. And the Americans were afraid the communists will take over big city like Beijing and Shanghai, Beijing and Tianjin, etc. So they would airlift Chiang Kai-shek's troops. They will send them on ships, on railroad, rush to take those land from Japan. And this led to the conflict between the U.S. Marine and the Chinese Communist Army during that period. And then there's a matter of Manchuria, because Manchuria is under Soviet Red Army occupation, and Chiang Kai-shek wants to go in. The Chinese communists also want to go in. And when American Navy ship loaded full of Chiang Kai-shek's troops tried to land in Port Arthur, the Soviet authorities said no, sorry, no. And then they so they were kind of stuck at the sea. They couldn't get in, and so they settled into this negotiation. In the meantime, the Chinese communists were able to march 100,000 troops into Manchuria, and they receive a lot of support from the local Soviet army, because one reason the Soviet army were able to make rapid progress in Manchuria was they were guided by a column of the Chinese communists called they're known as the International Brigade. These are the Chinese communist guerrillas who were fighting Japan in the 1930s and 40s, who were forced to retreat into Soviet Union after 1941. And among this group was future Korean communist leader Kim Il-sung. Kim Il-sung, he grew up in Manchuria, he fought in Manchuria, he joined the Chinese Communist Party in Manchuria, and he was part of this guerrilla movement. So these guerrillas, they act as guide interpreters to help the Red Army march into Manchuria. And the Soviet Red Army also trusted these people to take over administration in the cities, because the Soviet has no interest to administer a Chinese city. You know, they have no interest to run a Chinese city. So they let the Chinese communists to take over a lot of the local city government in Manchuria to run the town, to run the factories. And the Soviet were primarily interested in the railroad and Port Arthur. You know, they want to, and at that time they renewed the lease on the port in Port Arthur. So Soviet Red Army's Far Eastern Fleet have returned to Port Arthur at its headquarters. Now United States comes in, because there's the U.S. 7th Fleet. They thought the Soviet Red Army, the Red Navy, setting up shop at the tip of the Liaodong Peninsula in Port Arthur. They thought, okay, you know what? We're gonna put the 7th Fleet headquarters in Shandong Peninsula, just literally across a very narrow strip of water. At first, they went to the northern side of the Shandong Peninsula in a place called Yantai, which is just not that, like maybe like 10, 20 kilometers from Soviet base in Dalian, right? But the Chinese communists got to Yantai first, so they refused to have American Marine to land there. So the Americans then went around Shandong Peninsula to Qingdao. So Qingdao from 1946 to 1948 served as a headquarters of American 7th Fleet. And so they're right, very close. You know, you said the U.S. fleet and the Soviet Far Pacific fleet will come out. They will meet in the middle, right? They're neighbors. So this is why, like, Stalin did not like that at all. It's like, what are you doing? And you're airlifting troops to Manchuria. So this is when they increase cooperation with the Chinese communists. You know, initially they kind of keep the Chinese communists at a distance because they had a prior agreement with Chiang Kai-shek's government. You know, like Chiang Kai-shek's government say, okay, we'll agree to let Mongolia become independent. We agree to have you take over Port Arthur and control the railroad, etc. And in return for your recognition of Chinese territorial integrity, and then so they kept the communists at arm's length. But after the Americans get heavily involved, you know, after the American 7th Fleet moved in next door to the Soviet fleet, after Americans start to ship Chiang Kai-shek's troops to Manchuria, the Soviets suddenly became more friendly to the Chinese communists.
So it sounds like either Japan or the U.S. are pushing the two countries together.
Yeah, exactly.
True.
So that's when the Soviet Red Army commander will take the Chinese communist troops who just enter into Manchuria. They will show them the arsenal of the former Japanese Imperial Army. It's like, hey, you see this Kwandong Army arsenal right here? Okay, you can help yourself. and so this allowed a lot of the Chinese communist troops will start to take over a lot of the cities in Manchuria. So by the time when the negotiation finally agreed, the Soviet says, okay, you can't land in Port Arthur, but there's another port city of Yingkou. You can go there and land your army there. So when the American warships carrying KMT troops to Yingkou, they find that Yingkou was occupied by Chinese communists, and they aimed their guns toward the ships, and so they couldn't land there either. And so this is how Chinese Civil War started, because eventually the American ships that will go to Qinhuangdao, they landed the KMT troops there, and then the communists and the KMT that fought their first battle in the Chinese Civil War at the Great Wall, because the communists were trying to prevent the KMT from crossing into Manchuria. And then in March 1946, the Soviet began their withdrawal from Manchuria. But before they left, they basically handed over the key to the communists. It's like, okay, help yourself. we're leaving, but help yourself. And the communists took over a lot of the cities in Manchuria, but now the KMT are coming in. So Manchuria became one of the big battlegrounds for the Chinese Civil War. But now the communists, they got bolstered by the access to all the former Japanese arsenal. You know, now they had all these Japanese weapons from the former Japanese Kwandong Army. They became a lot stronger, and eventually this allowed and even during the Civil War, when it looks like the KMT might have won, Lin Biao, the commander of the Communist Army, he took everyone to northern Manchuria, where they will have back towards Soviet Union. And they have the back toward Mongolia, Soviet Union, and North Korea. So they actually had access to, for example, they would go to North Korea and say, look, you have all these Japanese, former Japanese Imperial Army arsenals in North Korea. You guys don't need it. We have a lot of grain. We can trade you for it. And this, and at that time, the Soviet Red Army in North Korea is like, oh, go ahead, help yourself. And so this is how the communists eventually won out in the struggle in Manchuria, and this would turn the tide of the Chinese Civil War, because Manchuria in 1945, 97% of the industrial output of China was in Manchuria, because Japan was building Manchuria as its second homeland, because they had they brought in millions of Japanese settlers to settle in Manchuria, and like 90 to 80% of electricity production was in Manchuria. So once communists took over Manchuria, it became like a war between an industrial country with still a rural country that was in the KMT control area. So it was game over. So this during this first phase of the Sino-Soviet honeymoon that immediately followed the communist victory, the Soviet contribution was obviously recognized, and at that time from 1949 to like 1960s, this first decade would be the honeymoon period, and there was a lot of Soviet culture, Soviet products. Because I remember one of the thing that was there's a floral pattern. It's like a red and green flower pattern. It's like very Belarusian. Like this kind of floral pattern became a fashion in China. What I read, I was trying to find out the origin. What I read was at that time there was a oversupply in Soviet Union of these fabrics, and at the time the Soviet Union were in need of grain or food, so they did a trade where China would trade food for these fabrics. But at that time the aesthetics is not exactly Chinese, so at that time the Chinese Communist government tried to convince people, to be patriotic, you got to buy these fabrics. But after a while, it became fashionable, particularly in Manchuria. Even like today, people in Northeast China, or what we call Manchuria, they people wear those like red and green like floral pattern.
I think I know what you're talking about. Yeah, no, it's kind of funny, but it's also like, in my mind, it's linked to the Soviet Union. So it's sort of like a reimagining of maybe folk patterns in a kind of more modern way. But I think we should mention in terms of legalities, right? This was the first major treaty, the Soviet-Chinese Treaty of, friendship, alliance, mutual assistance. And I think in Soviet historiography, they shortened that heyday period, the honeymoon period, to 1956, which is, of course, when Khrushchev came to power. Now, he didn't start with his antics immediately. I think the Cuban Missile Crisis can be used as one of the kind of focal points of his behavior. But of course, he was also engaging in revisionism, that in terms of ideological revisionism, right, and criticism of Stalin, that I don't think the Chinese counterparts liked very much. And it seems like in Russian historiography, this is described as one of the key reasons for the eventual souring of the relationship. And then, of course, you lead into the border conflicts that ensued in the late 60s, and all of those things sort of compounded on each other. How is this period interpreted, sort of the end of the honeymoon in Chinese history or historiography?
Okay, so older generation folks like my grandpa period, or even my father's, they would have remembered the honeymoon period, because that would be the time when my dad went to like elementary school or junior high. because at that time the Soviet provided general assistance to China. They pretty much helped China to industrialize. They provide a lot of the engineers, advisors, plans for new factories. The first bridge to build over there was no bridge over Yangtze River before the founding of the People's Republic. So in 1950s, they set about building a bridge over Yangtze River at Wuhan, and that was co-designed by the Soviet engineers. And so there was it's a full spectrum assistance. It's not just from it's all the way up to nuclear weapons. From setting up cars, like all the major Chinese car factories, like the first auto, FAW. Now it's the first auto works that in China that was set up in Manchuria with the help of the Soviet engineers. They did a lot of tech transfer. There was a massive tech transfer from Soviet Union to China in that first 10 years, and the relationship was generally good. Like I said, there was like proliferation of the Soviet culture. A lot of the older generation Chinese, they would know, all the old World War II Soviet songs like Katyusha. They would know what's the other one? The Knights of Moscow or something like that.
Moscow Knights. Yeah, no, I've listened to the. I listened to the performances. I mean, there's some really, really nicely. I mean, they're singing without accents. I don't know how this is possible.
and a lot of Chinese students were sent to Russia to study, like including former Chinese President Jiang Zemin. He was already an engineer at the first auto works in
Did he go to the Friendship University, or did he go into kind of a more industrial?
He might be, because he was already an engineer at that time. I think he went more like in the factories to.
Because the Soviet Union founded specifically for its outreach, in the international arena for the so-called global South. Obviously, China, the Friendship University, which still exists, it has a different name today. It still has lots of foreign students. So this is where most of them would go, and they would train them in various fields. I think agriculture, some industry, but also other fields.
And up to 1980s, up to the time I went to junior high, there was basically two foreign language options for Chinese students, either English or Russian. And at that time, it's not like elective. It's not like you choose. It's like they choose it for you. So I remember 1980s, all the parents are praying for their kids to get into the English class, but at that time, Russian was still a one of the foreign language. Like my dad, when he went to high school, he got put into the Russian track. So he actually learned English later on his own, but he initially learned Russian. So there was a lot of Soviet influence, Russian influence in the first 10 years, but then that will start to change. As you mentioned, when Khrushchev come to power, especially after his denunciation of Stalin. Now, to carry that out, he actually needed support from Mao because, because this was a pretty shocking thing he did in the communist world. So to curry favor with Mao, Khrushchev actually increased the first few years, he increased assistance to China, including giving China like the plans to build a fighter jet, tanks, warships, nuclear weapons, and like Soviet nuclear physicists came to China with a full design plans for nuclear bombs to China. But that will start to gradually come to an end in the late 50s. Because in the late 50s, there were several area of a contention. I mean, like one, Mao he's a communist, but he's also a nationalist. He like China are very sensitive about sovereignty. One of the issue is the status of Port Arthur. So during 1950, when the Sino-Soviet Friendship Treaty was signed, the Soviet agreed to return Port Arthur to China, and like that the Soviet Navy withdrew by 1955. Now, when Khrushchev comes into power, he wanted to bring the Soviet Navy back in, and he had a proposal to Mao's like, hey, what about a joint Navy? We joined Sino-Soviet Navy with its headquarters in Port Arthur, Dalian, and Mao was alarmed because Mao thought like, wait, you guys just left. Why are you trying to come back in? Like, we had the friendship treaty where you agreed to give the sovereignty back to China. So he thought that was Khrushchev wanting to sneak his way back to Port Arthur. He didn't like that, and I think another is personality conflict, because Mao, he may not have liked Stalin because Mao was kind of treated shabbily by Stalin, but Mao always respected Stalin. He always had highest respect for Stalin, but Mao did not respect Khrushchev because he thought, okay, well, like in the 1950s, in China, we call Soviet Union 老大哥, literally big older brother, right? But Mao cannot see Khrushchev as a big older brother. But Mao sees Khrushchev as like, who is this fool? Why do I have to?
Who is this peasant?
Yeah, who is this fool? Why do we have to take direction from this guy? How can this guy claim the mantle of Stalin and claim to be the leader of the world communist movement? So Mao did not like Khrushchev, and Mao did not respect Khrushchev.
Is it true that he interpreted the way the Cuban Missile Crisis was handled in 1962 as sort of pandering to the imperialist West, or is this exaggerated?
So yes, so this is Cold War. First, this is also related to China, and it's related to the Taiwan issue, because China, the goal was to finish the Chinese Civil War, unify Taiwan. Everything was set in motion. Like they had planned to, after the liberation of Chinese mainland, and Taiwan will be next. Then Korean War broke out in June 1950, and as a result of that, U.S. changed its policies. President Truman authorized the U.S. 7th Fleet to send its aircraft carrier attack groups through the Taiwan Strait to prevent the Chinese People's Liberation Army from landing in Taiwan. At that time, China didn't have a navy. Whatever's left of a navy was gone with Chiang Kai-shek to Taiwan. So on mainland China, there was no navy left. There's nothing they could do. They had lined up 500,000 men ready to cross the Taiwan Strait. Suddenly, they can't go to Taiwan, and Mao made the decision. You know what? We'll just take all this men, go north to North Korea to fight in the Korean War. But after the Korean War concluded, Mao wants to bring Taiwan back on the agenda. This led to the so-called first Taiwan Strait crisis in 1954. And at that time, there was still, China still had the Soviet support. In fact, in the so at that time, Chiang Kai-shek controlled a lot of offshore islands. And
I think behind the scenes, the Americans were toying with the idea of nuking China. I mean, I've read some documents. It was in that context, which was just like.
I mean, MacArthur said that during Korean War. He said, let's drop 30 nukes in Manchuria, create this radioactive cobalt belt, where the communists couldn't cross. For that, he got fired by Truman because Truman didn't want to expand the war beyond Korea. But the U.S. never gave up this idea of nuking China, and they planned to do that during the Taiwan Strait crisis. So during the Taiwan Strait, the Taiwan still the Chiang Kai-shek government still control a lot of offshore islands. And in 1950, they will use air base in Okay, we're back, folks. We have a little bit technical issue because
Blame the capitalists for this. I'm just kidding.
it's a lack of infrastructure. Actually, I live in a Bali jungle, and right now it's raining heavily during the rainy season. So
I was so envious of you, thinking like if I lived there, I could go swimming every day, and I didn't consider the downside.
well, I mean, Bali do have 5G in the more populated areas, but I don't like people, so I like to live in the boondocks. I live in the jungle.
I live in the boondocks in North America, so it's relatable.
Yeah. So I'm waiting for the Chinese to come here and upgrade everything to 5G. So where I was before we got left off, I was talking about in the 1950s, the KMT Air Force will take off on Zhoushan Islands, which is a group of islands just south of Shanghai, to regularly bomb Shanghai. And at that time, the Chinese didn't have much of an air force, so they actually invited the Soviet Air Force to come to station in Shanghai to defend the Shanghai, and then the Soviet would transfer radar to the Chinese coast to detect these KMT planes. So that's when the American advisor to Chiang Kai-shek told him, look, now you no longer have air superiority. Now there's Soviet radar, Soviet Red Air Force. Your force deployed in Zhoushan Islands are overly exposed. So he actually convinced Chiang Kai-shek to evacuate his forces from many of these offshore islands. That ended the bombing of Shanghai. And later, the Soviet Air Force that was stationed in Shanghai, they moved north. They joined the Korean War, but they were painted in the Chinese colors because the Stalin didn't want to officially enter Korean War. So the Soviet Air Force at the time, the Soviet pilot will wear Chinese uniform. Their MiG fighters will be painted in the Chinese colors. And this is a secret air war over Korea that people didn't even realize was happening until the Soviet archive was opened after the collapse of Soviet Union. But that was another avenue of cooperation. But in the during the Taiwan Strait crisis, Mao's goal is to still liberate Taiwan, but Khrushchev wants to reach detente with the West, and Mao saw that was anathema to the Chinese Revolution, because it's like, wait, you liberated yourself, and then you want us to stop us from liberating Taiwan because you want to make nice with the West? What is that? So this is Mao's beef with Khrushchev, and Mao also thought Khrushchev settled with the West, especially the way how Cuban Missile Crisis ended. Mao thought he compromised too much, because Cuban Missile Crisis came about because the NATO put missiles in Turkey. That's what led
Italy and Turkey. Yeah, I think usually, I don't think Americans, or at least maybe who are not students of history, realize that it wasn't the Soviet Union initiating this. This was, as often happened, in response to some American or NATO action. I mean, this could be extrapolated to the present day geopolitical circumstances too. But yeah, they had Jupiter missiles in Italy and in Turkey, and Turkey was essentially on the border of the Soviet Union, and that was a problem. And so the response was the cooperation with Cuba, and that's when the Americans freaked out. So yeah, it's interesting for me to see how this is interpreted from the Chinese perspective.
Yeah, so Mao thought that Khrushchev compromised too much, and Mao felt Khrushchev was selling out, basically. He felt Khrushchev was selling out the other communist movement. He's still like, wait, the communist revolution hasn't succeeded yet. There's half the world still needs liberation, but at this point, Mao is still for world revolution, right? And Khrushchev, you can argue he's more for building socialism in one country. That's Soviet Union.
I mean, that started with Stalin, so he actually inherited that with Stalin. So it's been the trajectory for the Soviet Union for 30 years almost.
Yeah, because at this time, whereas Mao was still exporting revolution, by supporting the communists in Vietnam, in Korea, but also throughout Southeast Asia. And Mao wanted to liberate Taiwan. And when he sees Khrushchev making compromises with the West, he feels like, okay, maybe Khrushchev is laying us out to dry, like so there's a lot of distrust, and there's in addition to the personality conflict, and so also Mao feel like, why should Khrushchev, this fool, be leading the communist movement? If anybody should be me, it should be me leading the communist movement.
Not this guy who is getting his shoot and slamming his table as he's giving his speech. This peasant. Yeah.
Where this is where I kind of wanted to know the Soviet perspective on this, because my guess is Soviets probably saw Chinese as ungrateful. After all this help that we gave you guys to industrialize, now you are. I don't know. This is.
Well, I think this is something that's debated. I mean, personally, I'm not a fan of Khrushchev, so I actually acknowledge a lot of the criticisms as legitimate. I'm definitely not a fan of his behavior in foreign policy, and so I think in Soviet historiography it's a matter of debate. Some people may perceive it as maybe a little bit of ingratitude, but I think others would also put more blame on the Soviet side, and that Khrushchev was a little bit of a clown in terms of personality and the way that some of these issues, that some would even blame him for maybe going too far initially with the Cuban Missile Crisis, for instance. So I think this is not something that's completely resolved. So my personal perspective is that I am not a fan. So I would acknowledge a lot of these criticisms as being legitimate. And he's definitely, regardless of what you think of Stalin, he was definitely a very ruthless leader, but he was extremely shrewd. He was universally liked. It wasn't just Mao that respected him. If you read the documents coming from, Truman's biographers, he really liked interacting with the man. And then, of course, they said, oh, we realized that Russia or the Soviet Union has these labor camps, and we started disliking him. But in terms of the personal interactions, FDR liked him, Truman liked him, other Americans liked him. I don't think Churchill liked him. That was another personality clash. That's a separate issue. But generally speaking, most of the Western politician leaders, military leaders, also really liked Stalin on a personal level. So I think
I don't like Churchill either. So I mean,
we're on the same page there.
Yeah, I mean, the contrast between Churchill and Stalin couldn't be more stark when it comes to India. Like Churchill was calling the Indians like beasts at the time when there was a Bengal famine, and whereas Stalin said, send the aid, send them the aid, and like the people starving can't wait. Paperwork can wait, but people can't wait. So Stalin wins hands down versus Churchill.
Churchill was not really into the idea of supporting the Soviet Union either. Remarkably, people kind of look at the clashes between the USSR and the US, or modern Russia and the US. The relationship between FDR and Stalin was quite good. And in fact, in that context of the big three, Stalin was suspicious of as he called them, the Anglo-Americans, but he was definitely had a much more amicable relationship with FDR and found more points of cooperation, whereas it was a little bit cool on the Churchill side. And so I don't think Churchill cared much about the Soviet Union. Obviously, after the victory in World War II, he gave the famous Iron Curtain speech. So he really instigated a lot of the stuff from the UK side, right? Americans were doing their own thing as well. Yeah, so I'm not a fan of him either. But regardless of what you think of Stalin, just the stature between Stalin and Khrushchev, just the to use a Hegelian term of the world historical personality, it's just not even comparable. So I think Mao's perception in that regard was definitely very accurate.
So this and the Sino-Soviet split became more apparent by 1962 Sino-Indian War, because at that time Khrushchev took the Indian side, and when China and Russia, the Soviet Union, were supposed to be allies. So it just got progressively worse and worse as the year went on. There was a time when after Khrushchev was overthrown in a coup, there was a time when was a time window for rapprochement. So the Chinese sent a delegation headed by Premier Zhou Enlai to Moscow. I think it was to commemorate like the founding of the Soviet Union or something like that. And at that time, I think it was Malenkov, one of the three who replaced Khrushchev. During the banquet, he told the Chinese delegation, he said, "Look, the problem between Soviet Union and China is basically a problem between Khrushchev and Mao. We did our job. We got rid of Khrushchev. All you have to do is get rid of Mao, and then we can all be back. We can all be happy again." And this was taken very seriously by the Chinese delegation, because Zhou Enlai, confronted him about it, and then the rest of the Soviet leadership, "Oh, no, Malenkov is just drunk. Don't worry about him. He's just drunk on vodka. Don't mind him." But at that time, they took it very seriously. So Enlai reported back to Mao. Mao did not like that at all, and so that only deepened the Sino-Soviet split. Because the Mao suspected that Soviets trying to sponsor a regime change in China, and so they started mass purging of like any officials who have ties to the Soviet Union around that time. And so this would lead to the border conflict in like late 1960s, 1969. So from what I have read, is like back in the Sino-Soviet honeymoon period, the border was largely unguarded. Like this, there was no issue on the border. I mean, the border issue arose is because there's a historical memory of all the land north of Amur River, east of Ussuri River that has to be given to Russia. But during the after the treaty, the border is supposed to run along the river, along the Amur River and the Ussuri River. But at the time during the conflict between Soviet Union and Japan, Soviet took some islands in the river. So this is just really just about a bunch of islands. But there was not an issue at all during the honeymoon period. I read some older account. People, the fishermen on the Chinese side, they will often cross to those islands to fish, to hunt, and they were not being harassed by the Soviet guards at all. But when the relationship tensed, suddenly the border issue became an issue. It's really the border issue was more of a manifestation of the Sino-Soviet split than a cause, I would say. And that led to like the clash of the Damaski Island in Chinese is called Zhenbao Dao. And so this island, it was China believes the border should run along the midline of the river. But the Zhenbao Dao or Damaski is on China feel is on the Chinese side of the border because the main line of the river goes through the other side. But the Soviet said, well, we had this control of this island since World War II. This should be ours. So this is where the two sides get the conflict get really heated. Like in the wintertime when the whole river get frozen over, the two sides will fight with sticks on ice, but that quickly escalated from sticks to firefights, and this led to finally this Americans start to take notice. They're like, oh, okay, so Sino-Soviet split is real. For a long time they thought that was just a hoax, they're just a hoax. But when this border conflict really happened in 1969, the American Kissinger, Nixon, they finally took notice. It's like, okay, so maybe we can exploit the situation. So this led to Nixon's visit to China, later normalization of ties between China and United States, and then so by 1980s, China would be firmly in the Western camp, like the anti-Soviet camp. And that happened when Soviet went into Afghanistan. China actually sided with United States. So at that time, U.S. would supply the Afghan Mujahideens with Eastern Bloc weapon, right? China make a lot of those because, you know, at that time, most of the Chinese weapon system were licensed copies of the Soviet weapon supply, like AK-47. And I don't know even why CIA even bothered trying to hide the origin of the weapon. I mean, everyone knew they were supporting the Mujahideen, but still, they purchased a lot of these AKs, the Chinese manufacturer AKs, to ship them to Afghanistan, and they do it. Initially, they were carried by mules into Afghanistan because there's no motor traffic. And this must be some pork barrel project by some American senators. So initially, they used Tennessee mules, and those Tennessee American mules could not hack the Afghan climate, so they will die in mass. And so then the CIA found another solution: is they will purchase hundreds of thousands of donkeys and mules from Xinjiang, which is next door, and send those mules and donkeys from Xinjiang to Pakistan, and from Pakistan to carry those weapons into Afghanistan for the Afghan Mujahideen. So,
yeah, I mean, the Americans started supporting the Mujahideen before the Soviet Union even was invited into Afghanistan. So, I mean, that was a kind of a typical plan that we've seen played out, the Brzezinski plan over and over again in American foreign policy. So,
yeah.
CIA
actually... Go ahead. Keep that in mind. I just like a little tangent. CIA actually had a lessening station in Xinjiang in 1980s to monitor the Soviet nuclear tests in Kazakhstan, neighboring Kazakhstan. Okay, go ahead. Back to you.
I just wanted to know your opinion on the way Kissinger perceives China, and the reason I'm asking is that, I mean, obviously he recently passed away, and people have very divergent opinions of him. Those who focus on something like the Vietnam War and the massacres, in that whole context in Cambodia and Laos, think of him as, one of the worst butchers of the 20th century. People who kind of focus more on the relationship between the Soviet Union and the US think of him as being a really great statesman who really paved the way for the rapprochement that took place, or détente, I guess, détente between the USSR and the US in the 1970s. And I read his book, I think it was published in 2014, The World Order, and he sort of made predictions as to what the world will be like. And, it's now been 10 years, and a lot of his predictions are coming to fruition. And I found his perception of Russia to be very surface-based. He kind of talks about Russia, it's this enigma, it's been formed by centuries of hordes of these, barbarian invasions, and that's why Russians are so brutal. Just very, I mean, it's not completely inaccurate, but very, very surface-based. Like, there's no attempt to go a little bit further. But when it comes to China, he seems to actually have a pretty good understanding for a Westerner about China. I mean, I can pull out a few quotes that I have in front of me, and he basically talks about that. Again, you could challenge him on this. I'm kind of curious, actually, what you think. So he talks about China as, the literal characters, the Middle Kingdom. He talks about China perceiving the world order, quote, as reflecting a universal hierarchy, not an equilibrium of competing sovereign states, end quote. So then China, as a result, prefers diplomacy. I'm misspeaking now, instead of military conflicts that do sometimes happen. And they choose to, quote, dominate psychologically instead of militarily. And so then he kind of goes and talks about the relationship between China and the US being formative for the 21st century, how China used to play by the rules of, I guess, the rules, what we call today the international rules-based order, but now it's more interested, now that it's becoming more important, in making its own rules. What do you think about that perception? Like, it seems to be a little bit deeper than the way he thinks about Russia. I think you're muted.
First of all, Kissinger and Nixon are actually well liked in China, because the Chinese don't care about what they did in other parts of the world. They were liked because they were the architect for the normalization of U.S.-China ties. So they're remembered fondly. Now, and I think one of the major problems with U.S. foreign policy is the U.S. foreign policy establishment has long been dominated by these East European immigrants.
Yeah,
you
by
know?
Brzezinski.
Brzezinski, Kissinger, all of them view Russia with like a colored lens, like they still they just
Well, Kissinger is much
that,
more balanced. I mean, Brzezinski was obviously a raging Russophobe, being a Pole, but also having his own motivations. But Kissinger was more balanced on the Soviet Union, kind of recognizing that, yes, it's one of the two superpowers. But again, reading his predictions about Russia, it's very, very surface based. Like, he doesn't seem to go any further. Whereas usually when you listen to Westerners and what they think about China, they say, oh, if China takes over, they're going to occupy this and this and this. And they're basically perceiving it through the lens of what they themselves would do, right? It's actually a little bit of projection, or a lot of projection in this regard. Kissinger is not doing that in this book. So I thought that was really interesting. And again, this was published 10 years ago, so he must have written it a little bit earlier. And so we're now, 10 years after the book was published, Kissinger passed away, and he's not inaccurate. He seems to misunderstand what would happen. He kind of talked about North Korea being a big issue instead of Russia, China, Iran being a big issue. Obviously, maybe he couldn't really, well, it might be his surface-based perception of Russia that he couldn't really foresee that, not an alliance, but that strategic relationship developing. But anyway, I kind of thought that he was, maybe because he's traveled there and he focused more on developing that as opposed to the relationship between the USSR and the US. He actually, I was pleasantly surprised to read this compared to his take on Russia.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think it's because Kissinger had a lot more exposure to China. He frequently traveled to China. He was brought on, even after his tenure ended in the political arena, he was brought on as an advisor group to a lot of the American corporations in China. And even just before his death, they literally dragged him out of the deathbed, sent him to Beijing. They had like an ambulance waiting for him outside the Great Hall of People, trying to salvage the U.S.-China relationship. Because at least Kissinger is respected in China, unlike Joe Biden or any other these jokers right now running Washington. I think he had better understanding of China because he had a lot more direct dealing with the Chinese leadership. Even though sometimes he's writing, there's still a little bit Orientalism in his perception.
Absolutely. I mean, the entire book is organized by region. I mean, he actually dedicates its separate chapter to China. But yeah, when he talks about Africa, he only talks about like Egypt or maybe a couple of other countries. The rest of Africa is irrelevant, which I think is kind of funny considering how important Africa has become, with France being forced to pull out, Russia increasing its cooperation there. Obviously, China has been active there for a while. Yeah, so that one he completely, lost. His prediction was completely untrue about Africa. But yeah, he's definitely thinking in terms of who is powerful now versus who isn't. And I guess at that stage, Africa, other than maybe Egypt, which has been historically kind of a U.S. ally, it was not important to him.
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely plugged into the U.S. elite circles. You can tell from some of those interviews, like one of the interview, he's talking about, there's some problem with, one of the problem in the China-U.S. relationships. There's some problem with AI. I'm like, wait, why is Kissinger talking about AI? This is obviously somebody's feeding this to him. My guess is former Google CEO Eric Schmidt and his cronies in his sponsored think tanks. So anyway, I think one of my favorite anecdote is when he went over to China to meet Zhou Enlai, and he asked about Zhou Enlai's opinion on the French Revolution, and Zhou Enlai said, it's too early to tell. And Kissinger thought, oh, wow, the Chinese really think of really long-term thinking. They still think the French Revolution is too early to tell, except it was a total misunderstanding because Zhou Enlai was thought he was talking about what was happening in Paris at that time. And that was like Zhou Enlai thought he was talking about the student movie in Paris. And so Zhou Enlai said it was too early to tell. And in Kissinger's mind,
it's like China
like,
has 5,000 years of history. It's too early to tell for them.
Yeah, so this kind of, I mean, it's very typical American image of China. You know, there's a lot of Orientalist trope, and in fact, that was still often quoted when Americans talk about China. It's like, wow, Zhou Enlai said the French Revolution. It's too early to tell, but but you know, we know a lot of those. So back to the Sino, back to the.
Well, I think we should talk about Gorbachev, who is a universally hated Soviet leader, but as we briefly discussed prior to going live, weirdly, paradoxically, he was one of the parties responsible for that reconnection at party levels, also cultural exchange levels. And this was in the late 1980s. So this was during Perestroika. This was literally before the Soviet Union was about to dissolve. And it's important to mention that it wasn't just this random collapse. It was a controlled demolition, which a lot of people regret these days. Definitely the public did not vote for this in a referendum, but how is this perceived in the Chinese circles?
So I experienced the rewarming of ties between Soviet Union and China because I was in China at the time. I was an elementary school student because I remember in around 1984-ish, I was going through my sister's old notebook because some of his old notebooks she hasn't used yet, so I reuse them. But my sister is 4 years older than me, so like her old notebook was produced in earlier times. You know, I found one notebook in the back that will have printed with political slogans, like in around 1979. That's around the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, when the relationship was really tense. So in the back, it says, "Be aware of the Soviet revisionism, resolutely against social imperialism, always aware of the." I mean, it's like really blatant, really like strident slogan. I reading that as an elementary school kid in 1984, I was taken aback. I was like, wow, that's too much. I mean, like, really? But, you know, that wasn't really that long ago. I mean, like, there was only 5 years separating 1984.
Well, I think it's interesting because I randomly came into this postcard collection from various family members going back to maybe the late 1800s. And I have a couple of postcards from the honeymoon period where randomly China appears. And they're actually not, I mean, you could find online what the propaganda imagery was like, but it wasn't actually the, you know, workers and farmers, peasants uniting and et cetera, et cetera. It was like folktale themes of Chinese, I don't know what the tale was, with like a Chinese character with tigers, and it had some kind of a label. So I thought it was kind of interesting going, you know, through these postcards that had totally different, you know, more like Eastern Bloc, and all of a sudden in the 50s you're getting all these Chinese postcards with beautiful imagery just like really randomly. So I think actually looking at these, you know, I wouldn't call it pop culture, but kind of print culture, I guess. I think it's kind of interesting to see that as a microcosm of the bigger political issues that were happening at the time.
Yeah, and then I would notice suddenly we have Soviet drama and movies on Chinese TV now. Like, that never happened before. Like, because before we would only get like a more friendly socialist country like Yugoslavia. You know, Yugoslavia film and TV were really popular back then because that was what allowed to be imported into China at the time. And then in the late like around 86, 87, I start to notice, oh, we can watch War and Peace on Chinese state television now. Wow. I mean, people were very excited about those because there's older generation, like among my parent generation, there's still a lot of nostalgia about kind of the Sino-Soviet honeymoon period. You know, this is also the period associated with their youth. So, you know, there's a lot of nostalgia for that. I mean, former Chinese President Jiang Zemin, he was famous for his nostalgia for his stay in the former Soviet Union. He will like show off singing Russian songs, etc., etc. this so like 1980. So the funny thing that you mentioned Gorbachev and his reputation, because in 1988 I remember, just leading up to the Tiananmen Square protest, at that time Gorbachev was widely liked among the Chinese intellectuals, and they would contrast him favorably against the Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping. I lived on a university campus because my dad was a lecturer in Chongqing University. So I spend a lot of time with university students. They will put up posters and stuff like that. And during the time when just before the Gorbachev visit to China in 1989, they will say, look at Gorbachev, he's so urbane, well-spoken, he's so young compared to our old fogey like Deng Xiaoping, who's like a literal fossil. And, look, Gorbachev is well-liked in the West, all the Western leaders like him. And so now looking back, I think, the college students were obviously very naive. I mean, that's what Deng Xiaoping thought about Gorbachev too. Actually, when he finally met him, he thought, "Wow, this guy is a fool." This guy may look like the famous quote by at the time the Deng Xiaoping's interpreter meeting Gorbachev. He said privately, Deng Xiaoping said, "Gorbachev, he may look smart on surface, but this guy is stupid." and but at that time, that was not how it was perceived inside China, particularly among Chinese intellectuals.
And then just a few years later, he's advertising Pizza Hut after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Is like, we were proven right.
So because in 1980s, the Chinese intellectual are very pro-West, like something you cannot imagine today. But back in 1980s, the West is kind of like the heaven. And when they saw that Gorbachev was being kind of promoted by, especially in the Western media, they all look up to Gorbachev, and they actually look down on Deng Xiaoping because they thought Deng Xiaoping should retire, and why can't we have some energetic young leader like Gorbachev? That was a prevalent feeling then. In fact, Gorbachev came to China right in the same time as Tiananmen protest was taking place. He was supposed to, normally foreign leaders will receive they will be received in the Tiananmen Square. And because the Tiananmen Square was occupied by 1 million students, so they had to do like a ad hoc ceremony at the airport, and then take him to meet Deng Xiaoping. But Gorbachev, he is definitely the one that ended the Sino-Soviet split officially. But it all actually happened long before, because I was looking up the careers of some prime minister of Kazakhstan, former prime minister of Kazakhstan. He studied in China in 1987. So, they already had exchanges, before the formal visit. And so this is something that a lot of Americans miss, because they think Russia, China, they think Sino-Soviet split. They don't realize the Sino-Soviet split was over in 1989. That was officially over. And after that, the ties have been very friendly. The border has been opened up. There was a lot of cross-border trade. The Chinese cross-border traders started going to Soviet Union, because at that time, they could make a profit by bringing Chinese goods directly to Soviet Union to trade for rubles. Back then, rubles was actually valuable, and they will come back with reports of Soviet Union. I mean, in 1980s, at the time when I grew up in China, Soviet was still seen as like Mao's formulation of the three worlds, like part of the first world, the two superpowers on par with the United States. And so it was a big shock when, as you say, when Gorbachev started to advertise for Pizza Hut, because that was totally unexpected, because everyone kind of expects the Soviet Union to adopt similar reform that was happening in China. That's what was understood in China. It's like they were doing reform. They were just taking a bigger step. They were just they were ahead of us, because they were also doing political reform as well.
Obviously the Soviet reforms did not go far enough, and they pertain to many different spheres, right? So for instance, the Soviet Union was still very much an industrial power, whereas the first world, right, the West was converting more to the computer, right, more beginning on its journey to the digital age. And so in that regard, the Soviet Union was behind. There was also a lot of issues with centrally administrating industries and just really anything, because it's such a, it was such a huge country. But beyond that, in terms of politics, there were issues there too. And I guess in my opinion, they should have let maybe, like the Baltics go, because those, those were on the way out around 1989 and towards, right, the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. But when there was that big referendum which excluded a couple of countries like the Baltics, but included most of the population, most people overwhelmingly voted for preserving the Soviet Union. So it was the leadership, and not every single leader of the republics. I believe Belarus voted against it, but other leaders decided to proceed. And so this is one of these questions that, why did it need to happen? And that I think the further we progress into the 21st century with all of its problems, this question keeps arising. Like, why was China able to reform and maintain itself, and generally maintain, with some changes, its ideological structure too, but the Soviet Union, the leaders chose to basically dissolve it. And of course, there's lots of theories. Some blame the internal issues or the specific individuals like Gorbachev and Yeltsin and some others. Others blame the foreign influence. I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. But yeah, I don't know to what extent China knew the disaster that the neoliberal 1990s were in Russia, but be that as it may, the political relation, the international relationship between the two in that early period started improving dramatically, right? And so then one of the big things that occurred was in 2001. So this was Putin, as in his early days, China and Russia signed the treaty that sort of forms the foundation for everything that's taken place up until now, right? The end of 2024, which is the Treaty of Good. It sounds so weird in English. It sounds normal in Russian, but in English, it's the Treaty of Good Neighborliness, Friendship, and Cooperation. And from that treaty came like more than 300 agreements of different kinds of treaties in pretty much all areas of cooperation. Because initially in the 90s period, most of the cooperation was about cultural exchanges, in the early 2000s, and language and sort of related fields. And then it went into solving big problems, right? So for instance, the 2005 agreement solved the border disputes. And so this is when China and Russia finally, right, resolved all the extant border issues. And I think some of these Russian ethno-nationalists freak out still because Putin gave away like 300 square kilometers to resolve this border issue, which, in the grand scheme of things, 337 square kilometers is really like a non-issue. But I know some people, are still freaking out about it almost 20 years later. So do you have any contributions to this sort of early 2000s period before we get into the really big cooperation from the late maybe 2019, like Putin's visit to China, and then of course 2022 being the big change in the strategic relationship?
Yeah, because I think like after this, particularly after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia was primarily focused on its relationship with the West. But at the same time, even during Yeltsin's era, he's still trying to maintain a friendly relationship with China. And remember when Primakov was prime minister, he tried to, at that time, he tried to form the alliance between Russia, China, and India as a counterbalance to the West. And that must happen after Kosovo, I think.
He is a very interesting character because remember, he is responsible for the famous turn over the Atlantic when he realized that NATO was going to or was striking the former Yugoslavia. So he was one of those people that I don't know if I would have expected him to have a backbone, but I mean, compared to the rest of the Yeltsin cabinet, that was surprising. If you're looking through our eyes today, right, in 2024, it's surprising to see someone in that early period actually standing up and saying, okay, they've now gone too far. So yeah, he was on his way to Washington to sign a bunch of really important agreements. And the plane literally turned around when he realized that NATO was illegally striking the former Republic of Yugoslavia, the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'd like to take the time to thank the Min Chen for the $30, I think the Australian dollars. Thank you. And thanks, Craig, for the $20 Australian. A Merry Christmas, Carl. A Merry Christmas, everybody here. And thanks everyone for the super chat. TC, great background screen and program. Thank you. So in the 2000, I think the border treaty was really great in removing the border issue as irritant. And similarly, like what you mentioned about Russian ultranationalists, there were a lot of Chinese nationalists who were also not happy about the border settlement. They feel that Jiang Zemin has sold out. They feel Jiang Zemin sold out by giving up claims to all these lost Chinese territory. You know, like they're talking about the territory lost in like 1858 and 1860. They're talking about the chunk of land north of Ussuri River and east of Ussuri River and north of Amur River. But really, by 2000, the real disputed territory are just few islands, a few islands in the Ussuri River and Amur River, and those are the islands that Putin returned, including the famous Damaski Island, or Zhenbao Dao, the site of the deadly 1969 border clash. You know, because the border, Putin agreed that the border should run along the midline of the river, as was the Chinese position. So a couple islands were returned to China, and it was good to stabilize because one of the problem with China-India relationship was the border issue. Border issue is one of the thorny issue in the bilateral relationship. So what the effect of the 2000 treaty was to remove the border issue completely as an irritant in the bilateral relationship. So both sides can get down to do business, and initially, you know, throughout 90s, early 2000, that was a primary interest of China in Russia, is to do business, but that started to change when the West particularly United States, cranking the screw on both China and Russia with NATO expansion and with U.S. manufacturing tension in South China Sea and over Taiwan. So this really kind of self-inflicted, I say, this is really self-inflicted defeat by the U.S.'s own foreign policy establishment. Again, this, I think, derived from the hubris and arrogance of in the moment of the unipolar power, because people really feel, okay, oh, remember that clip when Biden famously laughed about Russia? He said, well, what's Russia going to do? Is it going to turn to China? It's going to turn to Iran? Well, I'd like to see them try. Ha, 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 ha. This was like, I think it's late 90s or early 2000s.
I think it's the 90s. And this was also, I think, in Brzezinski's geopolitics, this was one of the things that should be prevented, some kind of a relationship between Russia, China, and Iran. And they got exactly what they were supposedly trying to prevent, which is really remarkable. Yeah, because I mean, if you look at that first decade of the 21st century, most of the cooperation, yes, there was business, of course, but a lot of it was just cultural exchanges and tourism, and they'll have a Russia year in China and a China year in Russia. So it wasn't really as strategically developed as the relationship is today. Now, of course, with the question of energy, things begin to change, right? I think that initial pipeline was released into operation around 2010, as far as I remember, right? The East Siberia Pacific Ocean pipeline into China. And then, of course, that energy relationship continued to develop into now.
Yeah, there's actually people, especially in the West, would not even know about this. That's actually a little bit little bit of a Japan-China rivalry into accessing the Russian gas. Because at the time when China first proposed to build a gas pipeline from China to the Russian Far East, then the Japanese proposed a rival a pipeline that will, instead of piping it down to China, will go to the coast like Vladivostok and then send the gas to Japan. And this was basically, Japan basically did it just to annoy China. But in the end, like Japan lacks the execution power, and so the gas went to China. And
Japan still has energy projects like the Sakhalin 2 project with Russia, and it's been allowed, I should say, by the United States to continue its energy relationships with Russia, where much of Europe was essentially completely banned. I also think that's kind of an interesting relationship in terms of who is the bigger lackey in this regard, right? Germany was entirely screwed with completely being cut off cheap Russian energy, and now much of it is going through India. So India is making the cha-ching and reselling it back to Europe. And I believe the recent news was that the Americans are doing the same with Russian gas and also selling it to Europe. And Europe is just taking it lying down. But Japan was allowed to continue some of these energy relationships and some other smaller, like importing cars or used cars, like things that Europe is not allowed to do, Japan is allowed to do. So I think it's kind of interesting. And Korea as well, maybe South Korea to a lesser extent. So I think the way East Asia is being treated by the US versus Western Europe is really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, because it's interesting because the Far East, Russia, they was kind of in the economic backwaters after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And they initially received a lot of investment from South Korea and Japan, and China actually floated an idea to jointly develop like the border zone between China, Russia, and North Korea, but that didn't pan out because of sanctions. But China has always been very interested to develop more economic ties because the northeast China, or what some call Manchuria, that area, it was kind of the Rust Belt of China. It was industrialized very early on, but now it hasn't fared so well under the market economy. And so China is very interested to develop that area, and they felt the way to develop is to deepen the ties with its neighbors like Russia and North Korea.
I think this is the source of one of the propaganda tropes that range from China will physically invade the Far East, the Russian Far East, to China is already colonized the Russian Far East. You just don't know about it. And I actually had a conversation about this with someone recently where, this person was giving me some information that I didn't even fact check. It doesn't ultimately matter to what my point is, but I think it had something to do with a particular region. It was either like logging or preferential access giving to the Chinese companies. And this person was really angry about China. This is a Russian person. And I said, well, who is giving them preferential access? It's the local Russian government. If this is a problem for you, then you should be mad at that particular government there. Not the Chinese are going to come in because, like, hey, it's a business opportunity. We're going to make easy money. Like, what are they going to not take that opportunity? So I thought it was kind of a really funny way of perceiving it. But this is something that was prevalent, I think, like in the late 90s, 2000s in some of these ethno-nationalist circles. But now it's brought back into kind of the forefront in the context of some of this Western propaganda coming from Western Russian language sources, like, the BBC, Voice of America, Deutsche Welle. They all have their Russian language sources, and they're really pumping out this whole China is going to conquer Russia in one way or another. Russia is just a lackey to China. Somehow when Russia is a lackey to the West, it's not a problem, but, that's left outside of the article. But it's kind of interesting to see that re-enter the conversation again, and now that the relationship between China and Russia has strategically developed the way it has.
Yeah, that's definitely the common trope in the 90s and in the early 2000s, because I remember because I'm always interested to read about Russia and also Russia-China relationship. And the only thing I can read about in the Western media is about those. There's tension. There's tension. You know, Russians are not happy. The Chinese are coming. They're taking over. And I have to tell people, or give a reality check. Like even China in living in Manchuria in the northeast, most of them, they go to southern China where it's warm. This is the same. Humans are the same everywhere.
Yeah,
Even
I think
the
some of the lands that are supposed to be conquered by China are really inhospitable. So like no one actually wants to live there. And I mean, this is the reason why Putin has been giving out essentially like free land in the Far East to develop it, because no one wants to go to some of these places because it's difficult in terms of the climate and, you know, the weather and the lifestyle. So yeah, it's kind of interesting how that never gets mentioned.
Yeah, the joke in China is those people from northeast, from aka Manchuria, those people are taking over southern China because they're all fleeing the winter. You know, if you go to like holiday location like Hainan Island, you see a lot of people from northeast China. Like they're afraid of the cold too, and so it's quite pretty ridiculous that they would go to they would think to go to Russia because the area in. Oh man, I forgot to shut the door, so now my son is coming in. Okay, but how are you doing on time, by the way, Dina? Because we are already at 2 hours. Oh, are you on mute? I can't hear.
I'm sorry. I think I keep muting myself so that there's no feedback from the mic. I'm okay on time, and I still think we should go through some of the common propaganda tropes that both countries face, because they seem to parallel each other, and you know, it's not accidental that this is the case.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of projection when they talk about China or Russia. I mean, like the common trope is, like you mentioned, like China is gonna take over Siberia. It's like, why, when China can just buy it from Russia? I mean, this is right now. China and Russia has a complementary economy. Russia is primarily a commodity exporter, and China is commodity importer. And this relationship has proven mutually beneficial. And not to mention, both are nuclear powers. I mean, it's not going to happen. Have like a large scale war between nuclear powers, and for what? Just so you will. It's like this projection is more like these Western commentary. I think this is what we would like to have.
Exactly. This is what, but also like this is what we would do. So we think this is what they're going to do, and then they're surprised that that's not what happens. I think one of the most common tropes is that simultaneously China or Russia is collapsing, and at the same time it's about to take over the world. And sometimes you get those articles in the mainstream media at the same time. And so when you put the two together, it's just completely illogical, and nonetheless they're still being pumped out. Right. I think the ones I keep seeing about China, let's say in The Economist, which is one of our favorite sources, if you don't want to know anything about economics, is that, you know, China is doing extremely poorly economically. And if you go back a few years, you'd see the same trope over and over again. And it's kind of rebranded depending on what the particulars are, but it's the same idea. For Russia, it's the same thing from about early 2000s. And back then it made more sense because Russia was recovering from the 1990s, that Russia is about to collapse. But when you have that same headline going into now, and it's now been 25 years, it's a little bit more sketchy. And at the same time, you know, when Russia is done and Ukraine is going into the Baltic and Poland and Germany and maybe even London, and is going to, you know, conquer all of Europe because it was prevented from doing so in 1945. And I think for China, it's the same thing with dominating, you know, all of Asia, perhaps even as a, you know, formal empire. You kind of see those two parallel to each other.
I completely agree. I mean, like for someone who have lived in China in 1980s, today, China-Russia relationship at its best ever for a long, long time. Because 1980s, there was a serious scare in China that you know, serious confrontation. The Soviet tanks would roll up to Beijing. Like in 1979, during the Sino-Vietnamese War, when China went into. Sorry, that's my son playing in the background. So during 1979, the Sino-Vietnamese War. Can you, Baba Kujar? Okay, Baba Kujar, don't stop, patient, stop for a second, Baba Kujar. Sorry. Okay, so in 1979, during the Sino-Vietnamese War, the China put the whole northern frontier on alert. All the border with Soviet Union, Mongolia, they evacuated 300,000 people in expectation, just in case, because they remember the Soviet invasion of Manchuria in World War II. They remember the Soviet tanks basically reached the Great Wall in a month. And there was nothing like in the flat land of Inner Mongolia to stop the advance of Soviet tanks. And that was a major concern for strategic Chinese thinkers throughout 70s, throughout 80s. So this is one of the few times in Chinese history where China no longer has a northern threat on its frontier. Now China can mainly focus on its coast, and this is what China right now. Its top priority has always been Taiwan, and that's there's zero interest to start a conflict with Russia, especially.
I think it's also
Russia
geopolitical because the two countries are primarily land powers, and the countries that are projecting this are maritime powers. So they're not thinking from the perspective of having been invaded on many occasions and having to face that border issue. And so it's almost like their analysts are thinking from the perspective of what an island power would do, and they're not really even bothering to put themselves in the shoes of a land-based power and the issues that they've faced historically. So I think that's one of the issues built beyond the propaganda. But I think the other interesting parallel is the weaponization of diasporas. And I don't know, Carl, if you could still see me, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the weapon. Can you see me, Carl? Uh-oh, you're muted. I think you're still muted.
My son just turned off my camera, so sorry.
Oh, no.
He wants me to play with him.
Just a few more minutes, and we could play.
Okay, hold on. Why don't you take over for a few minutes, and then I'll pass him to his mom.
Sure.
I'll be right back.
Sure. I'll take over. I'll go back to talking about the diasporas. So Carl, when he comes back, he can elaborate more on the weaponization of the Chinese diaspora. But I want to talk a little bit about the weaponization of the Russian or Russian-speaking diaspora. Now, obviously, diasporas are diverse. So in terms of Russian speakers, they started, the ones whose families are still around and identify themselves as Russian or Russian speaking, some of them started immigrating with the Russian Revolution, and then waves came after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. There was a huge wave in the 1990s and up until now. And so these diasporas are pretty diverse. And depending on what happens specifically to their family, they may have different political opinions, different ideologies. And so there are clashes within these diasporas. I think as far as North America goes, the estimate I saw was around 3 million, but that's not just ethnic Russians. It's basically people from maybe the former Soviet Union who identify themselves as Russophones. So they might be multi-ethnic, multi-religious. And so some of these people, maybe some of them who immigrated from Russia, may be opposed to, the current Russian government with Putin. Others may be someone like me who is neutral to facing towards maybe more patriotic, but also not like a hysterical patriot that doesn't recognize some of the issues that may be happening in the country. And so obviously when you have this population, some of which still has passports and is capable of voting in elections, they can be weaponized. They can be weaponized in the media by producing articles. They can be weaponized on social media, sort of new media, and they can be used to disseminate anti-Russian narratives. And again, when Carl comes back, I think he can fill in about the Chinese counterpart to this. But basically, a lot of these people are the ones who are staffing some of the Russian language Western media, the BBC, Deutsche Welle, et cetera, et cetera. And so these people are being weaponized and being used as sort of the token Russians who escaped evil totalitarian Putinism. And they're in the Free West. They're still using the trope of the Free West, even though we're no longer, in the duopoly of the Cold War. And, Russia is not a communist state. Nonetheless, these immigrants, these diasporas, partially, are not everyone, again, like I said, are being weaponized to criticize the internal dynamics of Russia, to specifically target Putin. Some of them are getting, if they're not in the media or in social media, some of them are getting NGO funding. And so I think Carl can contribute to the weaponization of the Chinese diaspora in this regard, which I think is going to be similar.
I think journalist Yasha Levin coined the term "weaponized immigrants." I think it's exactly the same. I mean, nowadays you see a lot of the anti-China articles in the Western media. It's written by a person with very Chinese names. This is basically kind of like the yellow face they put on, so they can't be accused of racism, right? But like these people, they have access, they have a platform because they're sprouting the narratives that people want to hear. They sprout the narrative those platforms are supporting, and this is why you have the cult following going to have such a reach in the United States. They have run one of the most profitable right-wing newspaper, Epoch Times. They have the channel China Uncensored, which have tons of followers on YouTube. They sell a product that people want to hear, which is a lot of copium, basically. And that China is bad. If you think US is bad, no, China is much, much worse. So don't think you have any alternative. United States is as best as we can do for you.
What motivation do you think some of these weaponized immigrants have? Do you think it's like personal grievances of their family that have a particular lore to how they escaped? Is it like pure sociopathy where they're just doing it for the money and the clicks? They don't really care about what they're promoting, that says this is their job and they'll do it? Like, is it narcissism? Like they're becoming these micro celebrities in particular circles? Like, what is it? I mean, it might be different for everyone, but I'm always amazed by what's the personal motivation by not just criticizing maybe the government, but just everything about the culture in your home country, just things that should really not even be applicable to criticizing, particular political system. It's a lot of this, like you said, yellow face, a lot of this kind of self-hateful xenophobia or racism. Like they're also just really attaching themselves to these anti-Russian or I guess anti-Chinese tropes, and they're really amplifying them. And like it's just going way too far beyond like, okay, I don't like Putin, but I would like this other guy who is more pro-Western power, because they consider Russian, kind of average Russians, like sometimes they'd use the term biomass, right? Some of these pro-West liberals, for instance, and at the same time, they're wondering why they're not getting elected, like, why is the biomass not electing me into government? I don't understand. So, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's going so far that it's beyond just, okay, I live in the West, I believe in, liberal capitalism or whatever. I want Russia to have this other government, but Russian culture is great and these other things about Russia are great. Like it's way beyond that. So it just kind of amazes me, and I don't know if I fully figured it out.
Well, I think it's all in the above. I mean, there's always a little bit of everything. For many of them, it's self-aggrandizement. Some of them is employment. I mean, they're only allowed to say what their salary dictate, and this is what sells in the West. That's what because some people actually like to hear that Russia is doing poorly, China is doing poorly, so the U.S. by contrast doesn't seem too bad. I mean, this is why all these people have not only have a white platform, but they also have a lot of followers. They are selling the propaganda that people want to hear. but the end result, of course, is the average readers, their average audience are getting a very distorted view of China, what China and Russia is. And I remember distinctively one journalist, a British journalist, I don't know, his Telegraph or he wrote about his brother coming from Britain to visit him in China and complaining to him, say, why is this China looks nothing like the China you wrote about, but his rationalization is that, oh, because he's just a casual tourist, he only spent a few days. Unlike me, I have been posting in the country for years, so I know more about nuances, which is no.
Well, I call it dumpster diving journalism, because you can go and find a wrecked street or an abandoned house that's falling apart anywhere. Like, I can come out of my house and take pictures in the US and in Canada. And this is what they do, and this is how they want to present the entire country. And places like that exist everywhere, as does, the more industrialized parts, as do, urban environments are nicer than maybe certain parts of the countryside. Like that's applicable to really any place. But these people really, what they present as nuance, right? They're really into dumpster diving journalism. They want to only select the worst things that happen and only present you with that, as opposed to even giving you any kind of a balanced view. And I guess I just find it really gross, because I am not a fan of American foreign policy, NATO foreign policy, but I'm not going to go and drag the US or Canada through the mud by taking pictures like that. It's really, it doesn't really add anything, and it really makes you appear more, just hostile and biased and gross. And I just don't understand when other people do that. So I think the other one we should talk about is the exploitation of any possible internal issues. So for Russia, for instance, one of the internal issues would have been the Caucasus. We know that Russia in the 90s and the 2000s, up until 2009, was engaged in the two Chechen wars, and the entire Northern Caucasus region was unstable to various extents. I kind of perceive it almost like as a training ground for what later happened with Syria, because the militants that were coming into Russia were not like Chechens. I think, according to some estimates I've seen, they came from dozens of different countries where radical ideology that was linked to religion existed. Countries like Saudi Arabia, they would actually be way high up in the ranks. They were not the foot soldiers. So these people were used by, let's say, Western powers, at least according to Putin, has given interviews about this. You guys are welcome to go and do your own research. This is sort of a side topic, but be that as it may, the region was very much stabilized after 2009. There are still counter-terrorist operations there periodically. It's definitely way more stable than before. There's a lot of tourism and development, a lot of money going there. Chechens are now, the biggest Russian patriots, which in the early 2000s was just not imaginable that this would even be the case. And this is the region that's been exploited, whether by working with these extremists, but more recently, like in, I think, around maybe 2015, 2014 or so, you had a lot of real bizarre coordinated propaganda. There was one that was published for months about gay concentration camps in Chechnya. I mean, it just sounds really, it's just like hard for me to say without laughing. And it never really took off, but I kind of see the connection to the exploitations of China's internal issues in that particular regard, almost like a little test that they then ended up exploiting with bigger stories that are still out there, right, about the re-education camps and all that stuff. Can you elaborate a little bit on this? Still muted. Carl, you're muted.
I definitely see similarity between what. Can you hear me now? I definitely see similarity between what NATO has done, for example, in Chechnya versus like the Xinjiang atrocity porn they're promoting right now, against China. The goal has always been to balkanize China. I mean, that they do that in Chechnya for Russia. They do that in Xinjiang and Hong Kong for China. I mean, Hong Kong the 2019 Hong Kong protests, it was presented as this fight for democracy and freedom, when on the ground it was kind of very ugly localism and anti-mainlander racism. That's rarely reported in the mainstream media. There was a lot of violence. People were set on fire. You don't see that in the Western media at all. You see, instead you think these are a bunch of idealistic youth who are fighting government oppression, right? And they're even talking about, oh, this is a Tiananmen Square 2.0. And I'm like, that's ridiculous. I at that time I tweeted out, I'm like, there's not going to be any tanks in Hong Kong, right? Because the Hong Kong police will handle it, and they have been doing it very professionally. I mean, unlike how the West itself handles the protests, they rarely highlight, kind of the police violence that's meted out in places like Paris, for example, and Hong Kong is always like this peripheries. They try to encourage like the centrifugal force, and in case of Hong Kong, because it was a battleground during it was a front line of the Cold War, and US, UK, they had a lot of assets on the ground. In 2019, they just decided to, activate all their assets. Now they're complaining about the national security law China has implemented, because that will make all these cloak and dagger activity much more difficult. For example, we saw that with Radio Free Asia closing down their shop in Hong Kong because it said they can no longer operate in that environment. Well,
I mean, this is exactly why Russia cracked down on the same NGOs, the big ones, after the similar protests that were very much engineered in the second decade, like 2013, 2014. So, just a few years before the Hong Kong ones. But yeah, it was very much similar. And after that, the remaining NGOs were kicked out. And of course, we see that today, we can look at Georgia, right, a post-Soviet country, having to deal with this issue because it hasn't shut down the same NGOs, like the big ones, right, like the NAD and USAID, et cetera, et cetera. So you kind of see how harmful some of these NGOs can be.
Yeah, I mean, the NGO supposedly stands for non-governmental organization, right? But if you dig through their fundings, it all goes back to like U.S. State Department or some various government agencies, right? I mean, like Radio Free Asia, most famously, is just a cutout for the CIA. I mean, same for Radio Free Liberty in Europe. People who are more observant like us, who are media literate, we can pick out the propaganda and know what kind of useful information to glean from it. But for average public, they might be too busy with their lives. They maybe they just maybe read through the news casually. They did look at the headlines. The headlines paint an overwhelmingly negative picture of China and Russia and all the Washington's designated enemies. And that is the purpose. That's how, because, if one thing that U.S. do very well is marketing. United States invented marketing, and that this is marketing and propaganda. They're basically, there's a very thin line between the two, and so this area U.S. still far excel both China and Russia and yet they're convincing their public that people in Russia or China have been brainwashed or propagandized. But in fact, U.S. itself is probably the most propagandized country in the world.
Well, the fact that they don't recognize it shows that the propaganda is successful. They're just not even privy to it. But yeah, it's interesting. Radio Free Europe now has these little more targeted sources. Speaking of Balkanization, there is like one for the Caucasus, there is one for Crimea. So they're really kind of, even though they're not allowed to operate out of Russia, they're still promoting all this stuff, right, via social media and Russian language, whatever web resources they can be using, but they're more regionally oriented. So yeah, I've seen some of the stuff that they're they're promoting similar things for the ethnicities in Russia that are Turkic speaking, that they should only be speaking that language instead of Russian. So there's a lot of this going on everywhere. I mean, if you really pay attention, it's kind of disturbing. So I think go ahead.
It works well because there's a lot of ignorance about China and Russia. People don't know the context, and what the context they do know, they know about U.S.'s own history of colonization and genocide. So to project that onto Russia and China, for example, in China, they're now doing propaganda campaign on the boarding schools of, in a lot of the boarding schools it's pretty common in China, especially in like remote areas. So they have a boarding school where all the children will stay a month at a time, and then before they go home visit family. And this they are labeling this boarding school as the cultural genocide, because they're comparing it to the Indian boarding school that exists in Canada and US. Again, they're using their own experience trying to project onto China the great unknown, and then people buy it because they don't know any better. They don't know any difference. They've never been to China. They don't know what's it like, but they do know U.S. government and Canadian government did run this boarding schools in their Indian reservation with the goal to wipe out the Native American culture. But in China, they're just boarding schools. I mean,
right. I mean, in my understanding, China also has like high school boarding schools. If a student is too far away, they go for like the 5 days and they come home and then they go again, because it's just not logistically possible for them to, like, they want to go to a good school, but they're too far away. So that's where they live, which to me is like, how is that different from any other preferred boarding school with a good education? But apparently...
And they were against the bilingual education in China because they say, oh, they're teaching standard Mandarin in school, so that's cultural genocide. I mean, like, are you kidding me? Like, it's like in United States, you're not going to teach English. I mean, this is just the common language.
Yeah, and instead of perceiving them as being reincorporated into society and actually giving them the tools to go anywhere in the country, they want them limited to this one region so they could be exploited easier. I mean, apparently this would be what they want, right? So yeah, I think the other trope is the crazy dictator, not just a dictator, but an unpredictable crazy dictator. And that applies not to just Russia and China, but also to North Korea. So I thought the recent incident was the most cringe coup d'etat in history, which was in South Korea, where President Yoon tried to bait Kim into attacking South Korea by dropping on those leaflets in, what was it, on October. And Kim was apparently much more reasonable and not crazy, contrary to Western propaganda, to fall for that. But the crazy guy was Yoon, who obviously failed after 6 hours. So I think it's like a little bit of buying your own bullshit as well about these leaders outside of the Western run order.
Yeah, I think that actually makes sense because now that makes sense of why North Korea blew up all the road that was leading into South Korea, so they cannot be blamed for any false flag attack. Look, there's no road, and because it's not beyond the capability of U.S. or South Korea to stage a false flag attack.
Well, I mean, did you read that report? They were going to dress their special service people in North Korean uniforms. It's like a really awful B movie that you'd watch in an airplane.
And they were gonna kill
their own people.
Kill the leader of the Yoon's own party, and try to blame it on North Korea. It's crazy. It's like it's straight out of a Hollywood plotline or a Korean movie plotline.
Yeah, it's like a bad Korean movie that you watch on an airplane because there's nothing else except it's real. Yeah, so I thought that little anecdote about crazy North Koreans that ended up being much more reasonable than South Koreans is a really perfect illustration of projecting this, and as you know, I traveled to Japan. I'm a Japanophile, which doesn't mean I endorse their some of their historic atrocities of foreign policy. But you talk to, if I talk to my Japanese friends that say, oh, we love the Chinese, they travel here all the time, it's too bad their leader is so crazy. And then you ask them for an example of like, what was it that he did that's so crazy? And it's just, you're met with silence. So it's just kind of interesting how this propaganda goes far beyond the immediate, Western sphere. Now, obviously, Japan is its own animal that has historical, issues in the region. But nonetheless, it's kind of funny how that particular propaganda follows through. And for my own language studies, I sometimes read easy Japanese news, and the language is exactly the same as in the Western media. It's like as if they're being, they're coming from the same source, which of course they are. So it's really not surprising. Carl, but what I think I'm assuming you want to wrap up this episode, is where do we go from here? And I think what we should focus on a little bit is BRICS, because one of the big criticisms for BRICS is that it's a little too amorphous, it's a little too vague. And even though initially it was supposed to be this economic club, it's become more than that, because if you look at, media coverage from when it initially was launched, the West was not taking it seriously. These days, there is a lot of anti-BRICS propaganda. Some of it is like extremely exaggerated, which means they're taking it seriously. But I think the issue is that the different countries in BRICS kind of want to use it for their own purposes. Usually, the way it's described officially is that Russia and China are trying to develop multipolarity, whereas countries like India are basically, for them, it's just another economic club. They want to kind of deal with everyone, so they're not going to pursue what China, the China-Russia strategic partnership is trying to achieve. And obviously, the fiasco that took place in Kazan with Venezuela and Brazil essentially blocking it. I mean, this was kind of a prime example where BRICS seems to be in need of more definite rules. And as bad as it sounds, maybe a little bit more administration. I mean, everyone hates bureaucracy, but it seems like it's insufficient in terms of defining what the organization is and just kind of giving it more of a form. What do you think about it?
Well, I think people make a mistake thinking like BRICS is some kind of anti-NATO alliance, which is not. BRICS originally is literally coined by Goldman Sachs as a marketing term for selling the stocks in Russia, China, India, and it's a marketing term for selling stock. It just so happened it became an economic forum, and I think for most countries, new members of the BRICS, I think Indonesia is joining next year, and this is for them. It's more a new international forum of international cooperation, and especially in the economic sphere, because they do see all the dynamic economies are in the BRICS. BRICS right now already composed of large GDPs than the G7. And that it is still growing. So people don't want to miss that boat. But at the same time, like you say, it's not a military alliance. It's not NATO. NATO has a very specific goal, which is to keep the Russia out, keep the German down, and to keep the US in. A BRICS is more like a forum for multipolarity for different countries to explore a way to cooperate economically. So I don't see BRICS shaping up into some kind of like the equivalent of NATO. I don't
think it's possible because with Egypt, which is kind of a US, maybe not an ally, but a good friend historically, right, since the 1970s, since it's left its relationship with the Soviet Union, that would not be possible. And I don't think we want that for BRICS, but I feel like in an attempt to, maybe help Venezuela and develop it economically, there should be kind of more of a structure in preventing what happened with, Brazil blocking, using its kind of personal reasons to veto its candidacy, things like that. Also kind of figure out whether there's such thing as too many members where it becomes detrimental to making decisions. You kind of see that in the European Union, which of course is like its own different political economic body, but it's just an example of being too bureaucratized. So we kind of want to find a happy medium for it. And again, some people see BRICS as kind of like this organization, even though it's, again, very amorphous. It's being led by China, but other people don't want it to be led by China. So this is kind of what I'm talking about.
Well, I think people need to give it time. BRICS is still very young. I mean, like the whole thing, BRICS only gained prominence, I would say, in the last few years, especially after Russia's SMO, and then people start to see BRICS rather than the economic forum more as like alternative to the Western lead international institutions, especially at the time when United States is actively sabotaging all the international institution that itself helped to create after World War II. Alternative is sorely needed, especially when UN is just like useless, completely useless at this time.
Well, you have the two leaders, right, of Russia and China talking about the fact that it's possible to adhere to international law in maybe some new way. Do you think this is even like, is the UN reformable? Do you think it's possible to sort of pursue multipolarity more in line with, they always, like, Putin always goes back and refers to the UN Charter, and I think China occasionally does too. Sort of going back, like, this is our original framework. It's flawed, but this is the best we have. Why don't we go back to using it? How do you view this?
Well, I think they will always, China and Russia will always bring that up, because this is because United States is obviously not acting in the spirit of UN Charter in every way. And especially with Donald Trump becoming the president in the next 4 years. So this will be more of a talking point for China and Russia. I would say, it's too early to say. I will quote Zhou Enlai's word on French Revolution. It's too early to tell.
Well, BRICS is a little bit younger than the French Revolution, so we might be waiting for a while.
Yeah. I think I mean, see, actually, it actually has a lot to do with what US and NATO do. I mean, a lot of the problem that US incur is really just self-inflicted problems.
I think this is the justification for the existence of NATO, because in the 90s it kind of lost its reason for existence, because it was the Warsaw Pact self-destructed, it voluntarily dissolved, and it no longer had this so-called threat in the East. And it's almost like during the Cold War, even though I'm coming from the Soviet camp, you could sort of kind of justify the existence of NATO, at least in that region, a little bit more than you can today. And then NATO basically found its new life with the strikes, the illegal strikes against Belgrade and, the former Yugoslavia. And it basically started creating these issues that to which then Russia could not respond. And I think it was, what is that famous Richard Sakwa quote, that NATO exists to challenge the problems that are the result of its existence, something like that. You guys can Google his name. It comes up as like one of the top quotes. And basically, you're right. So all of that incursion into, the former Soviet sphere, but not just the former Soviet sphere, like Poland. I don't think, Russia cared about Poland or, the former Czechoslovakia. But when you're literally doing exercises in Estonia, 300 meters from the Russian border, it's very, very aggressive. And it's much like what happens with some of these powers next to China, right, in the two seas, and then the screeching happens about these are international waters. This is, someone else's land, and it's very provocative. We know what would happen if China and Russia were doing, the opposite near American borders, or any, Britain's borders or something like that. So yeah, it's definitely it's kind of like we talked about the result of the current relationship between Russia, China, but also Iran. This is partly or largely the result of geopolitical circumstances that were created by NATO countries.
Yeah. I mean, the whole coming together of BRICS is kind of a response to US and NATO running amok. And right now NATO is claiming to form partnership with Japan. They're expanding to Asia now.
Because that's what the North Atlantic stands for. I mean, right off the bat, they obviously had Greece and Turkey, which is not exactly the North Atlantic either. But yeah, now they're definitely not in the North Atlantic by opening or claiming to, open an office in Japan.
Yeah, so we'll have to wait and see. But we definitely need to do this again, because I feel like there's so much topic that remain to cover. And I really appreciate your unique perspective, being the one that you not only you are fluent in Russian, but you actually grew up in Soviet Union. So you kind of have not only the both world of, say, US and Russia, but you kind of know what happened pre and after Soviet Union. And so
I think we can do a more targeted, more specific topic where we'll have the ability to go into more detail. And I think we could sort of jump between each other's channels to do that. I think that would be interesting.
Yeah, I think that would be great. I very much would look forward to another collab. But we're already running in almost 3 hours, so let's wrap it up.
Let's wrap it up.
Unless there's a specific thing you want to talk about before we close.
I mean, considering that we covered this, we did a Putin with Tucker Carlson starting in the 1300s and going into 2024. Except I don't have a folder here sitting and schooling the audience. But essentially, this is what we did. So I think we did pretty well.
I agree. I think we need to do this again. So this is a very nice Christmas Eve well spent. Thank you, Nina. If for people who want to follow your work, where can they find you?
They can just use my name, my moniker, Nina Byzantina, on Twitter/X, on YouTube, and I post most of my work from there. Thank you for having me.
Oh, anytime. I really look forward to our next collaboration. We'll hammer out the details offline.
There's definitely a lot to talk about.
I agree. Thanks everyone for coming to the show to spend your Christmas Eve with us, for those who are in North America, or Christmas Day in Asia, where I'm right now. And we'll look forward to share more of our insights with you in the coming new year. And everyone, Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to you. Okay, I just ended this.